Hey there and welcome back to another My Hero Academia review. And today we'll be talking about the latest episode to drop, More of a Hero Than Anyone, which was essentially a masterclass in character development for Aizawa and Present Mic, and also an exposition episode that calls into question the nature of the Nomu, which we'd previously known were mostly mindless creatures that no longer resembled the people they used to be. But before we get into all that though, I just want to let you guys know that I have read the manga and I'm aware of any relevant future plot points and details. But for the purpose of these reviews, I only like to talk about what the anime is presented up to now and not go back and forth between the manga and the anime. It just helps to keep the review streamlined and allows anime-only fans to watch along and join in too. But with that being said, let's get started. Like many tragic and depressing episodes of anime, we start off this episode quite lightheartedly, with a brief recap of what everybody's been doing recently in their work studies, a reminder that Uraraka and Deku are the main ship in the show despite them not interacting much in ages, and Class 1A outgrowing All Might's attempts at humour and levity. Poor All Might. But in all seriousness, it was a really good choice to have this sequence, because this episode is mighty depressing, and you do need to break it up a little. And then this brings us to the meat of the episode. Aizawa and Present Mic's meeting with Kurogiri to determine whether he's in fact their former friend from high school who was killed during their time at UA. And honestly, this episode really added a whole new level to both Aizawa and to Present Mic. From the very beginning of their appearance in this episode, they were completely different to how they're normally portrayed. Aizawa's almost always cold, clinical, and calculating. Even in the most stressful situations, he doesn't lose his head, but simply gets to work and gets stuff done, like we saw at the USJ in Season 1, and at the training camp in Season 3. And then, over time, we saw him soften up a little in regards to his interactions with his students as they continue to get to know each other more, as well as softening even further when Eri came along. And so this is just another evolution, another facet of his character that we haven't really seen before. He was completely rattled, sweating, and acting impatient and angry in the car ride, and then was openly rude to the detective and to Gran Torino. Now granted, Aizawa was not the most sociable person, as has been made clear numerous times throughout the seasons, but usually this abrasiveness is really reserved just for his class, with the occasional jab at All Might or Present Mic. So for him to act like this is very much out of the ordinary and goes to show the gravity of the situation, and really just helps you understand how much this guy meant to him. And it's very much the same for Present Mic, who is usually just a minor comedic relief character. He hasn't really had that much development at all, besides him being a jokester who likes to mess with Aizawa. And so to see him so rattled and angry as well was actually some pretty interesting development and just reaffirmed that this guy was really important. Important enough for these two characters, who've almost never behaved differently from how they're portrayed, to kind of lose it a little. And another interesting tidbit from this sequence was the discussion of the nature of the Nomus and how they aren't actually living humans anymore, but simply a vessel that's been tinkered with. More a puppet than a person. Although clearly this episode sets out to prove that this isn't necessarily so clear-cut, and there's a bit of a grey area with this issue. After all, we see that the high end that attacked Endeavour retains the personality traits of the original man, and this is further compounded by the fact that we've seen Kurogiri shares traits with Shirakumo. And it's these similarities that upon closer inspection allow Aizawa to be convinced that they're the same person, with it being revealed that All For One's agent stole his body to get access to his quirk and used it to create the Nomu Kurogiri, who served as Shigaraki's handler and confidant until his arrest and imprisonment. So yeah, this episode's getting really dark really quickly. Body snatching a student and turning him to a living weapon to fight his old comrades. That's pretty reprehensible stuff if I'm honest. And from this conversation with the detective in Gran Torino, we head into one of the saddest scenes in the history of the show in my opinion. And it completely comes out of nowhere. Shirakumo may have been referenced, once or twice at best before this? And we'd never seen him before. But then they insert a cute little flashback sequence of the three of them at school together where we learn that they were going to form their own agency when they graduate, and that he died tragically during his second year work study. So already they've managed to get us caring about this guy just for Aizawa's sake, in only under a minute. Because he was his friend, and that seems to be a thing Aizawa doesn't have enough of, and you can see that his death haunts him. And then add on the fact that the guy seems to have been a true human cinnamon roll, and to me seems like he would have had a very similar personality to Lemillion. Very over the top, very caring and kind, boisterous, silly, but ultimately a badass when it comes down to it. And then the actual confrontation between the friends occurs, and it felt quite traumatic to be honest. Fairly quickly it becomes clear that Present Mic isn't buying that this is their deceased friend, denying that he's like him at all. But then Kurogiri's programming kicks in. His programming to protect Shigaraki. And Aizawa was able to make the connection between the two, because, as he says to Kurogiri, Shirakumo was the type of person to take in lost kittens as if it was his duty. Much like Kurogiri says it was his duty to look after Shigaraki, who in a way is just a lost little boy. And this revelation shatters the Iceman facade that Aizawa puts on, and he looks like he's moments away from projectile vomiting with disgust at what All For One's done to his friend. And this is where we learn that basically Aizawa's whole life has been shaped by the 1.5 years he spent being friends with this guy. He was originally the loner type of character, I guess the Todoroki of his friend group, closed off and full of self-doubt. But then he found his Deku equivalent in this dude who basically forces him into becoming his friend, using his first name from their very first interaction. And I guess from him, he also learned his affinity for caring for lost and abandoned things. Like the cat, like Eri, like Shinso. And he was even the person who gave him his first set of eye goggles, both so that he'd be safe, but also so they could be a matching pair. And then it's revealed that he even learned his strictness from him as well. But not from him personally, but rather his death. His friend was always blazing along, charging forward with no thought of the consequences. And I guess from Aizawa's perspective, this led to his death. And thus Aizawa's extremely strict on his students and loves expelling them and then re-enrolling them in order to send them a message and put a black mark on their record. This way they get a taste of death as he rips away their dream, before giving it back and pushing them even harder than before to improve, for them to realise that dying for the sake of justice is not the right path to take, so that he doesn't have to see any more children die well before their time. It's pretty much the same thing he did with Deku when he nearly destroyed himself in the very first class they had. He motivated him to control his strength, and not to sacrifice himself straight away. And all of this was inspired by Shirakumo. But then, on the other hand, he does want them to turn out like him as well. A hero who can motivate others. So basically he wants to take the best parts of Shirakumo and use them to create new heroes that don't have the defect of throwing away their own life recklessly. And this is kind of symbolic as well, considering this kind of thing actually happened to Shirakumo. All for one cherry-picked what he viewed as the best bits of him and discarded the rest for his own ends. And this whole sequence just shows how much of Aizawa's life view has been shaped by his own trauma and sense of loss. It's crazy that after 5 seasons of you thinking that you understand the character and why he is the way he is, it's all able to be flipped on its head in the span of about 10 minutes. Honestly, this whole scene is just nuts and really makes you feel for everybody involved. From Aizawa and Mike having to come to grips with the fact that this is actually their old friend who's been twisted and altered, to Shirakumo himself who's had his whole existence stolen away from him and twisted into the shape of Kurogiri, to even the people watching in the surveillance room. This is such a twisted thing to have to endure and to watch. And on top of all that, it's pretty haunting to see a character like Aizawa crying like he's Deku and screaming for them all to be heroes together. Seriously, it feels like an alternate universe Deku, Bakugo and Todoroki situation. And I think that parallel actually helps make it feel all the more impactful, which is kind of needed because we only just met this character this episode. So it could be harder to sympathise with him past a certain point. But when you're able to apply this to the characters that you know and love, it helps to build up that sympathetic connection. And it's at this point that it becomes clear that the Nomu situation's even more complicated than it was previously. Because after being confronted with all of this information and pushed to the limit, Kurogiri starts to freak out and his brain activity goes haywire. And in fact, it's revealed that yes, underneath the purple mist, he is indeed Shirakumo. And then we're treated to even more depressing scenes as he very briefly realizes what's happened to him and he remembers their promise that 2 of them would always be there to clean up for the third's mistakes, before telling them that he was altered at a hospital and falling unconscious. So yeah, I don't really know what to think about this. I mean, the scene itself was great and really delved into all 3 of their characters, but where does he go from here? This whole sequence set up Aizawa and Mike nicely for the future, but what about Kurogiri? We've seen that he can overpower his programming temporarily if given the chance, but are we going to see him reverse this somehow? Is this the first step at being able to de-Nomu people? But luckily enough, we don't have to wait too long to get an answer about the hospital quote from Kurogiri, as we see a Dr. Eggman lookalike going full mad scientist on Shigaraki. And considering the content of this episode has been that Nomus are more than what they appear to be, and that you don't seem to actually have to wipe out a person's mind completely to make them, it seems that Shigaraki is getting quirked up here. But I'm guessing he has the added bonus of being able to keep his mind intact. Well, mostly intact. He is criminally insane after all. And based on next week's preview, we get the start of My Villain Academia next episode, which if I remember correctly, was a very popular arc in the manga, so hopefully they do it justice. That being said though, these are all just my opinions, and now I'd like to hear yours. What did you think of the episode? Like it? Hate it? Make sure to leave a comment and let me know.